let's talk about queer theory. Um, my approach to this is to give you all a sense of what people mean when they talk about queer theory. So I'll kind of give you, I'll talk about the etymology of the word queer. We'll talk about kind of a history of the word queer. And the reason that I approach this topic like this, as opposed to just being like, here's what it does in debate, and here's why you can use it in debate in this way, is because the word queer is incredibly complicated. As it turns out, it's been used in pretty much every way you can think of throughout history, and especially in the last like 30 to 40 years or so. And so to get a sense of how it might be used in debate, I think we really need to have an idea of its history and kind of its meaning for a whole bunch of different people. And I hope that through that, it will give you a sense both of how it is oftentimes used in debate and how you can also respond to queer theory critiques as they are used in debate. So all of that is to say that queer is very slippery. It is a very strange word that means a lot of things in a lot of different contexts, right? So obviously the most common way that it's used right now is an umbrella term that refers to the LGBTQIA plus community. But it also means a lot of different things. And as we'll talk about in the 1990s, it was actually used as a challenge to that understanding of how it is used now. So queer theory is a post-structuralist theory. Post-structuralism. Post-structuralism just says that while there are social structures that can help explain how human interaction and society functions, those structures are not immutable. They are changeable and they can be altered in different ways. Okay, so structuralism is a turn in a lot of philosophy and critical theory and about 1900, maybe late 1800s. And people said, you know, here is how we can understand how people work, right? So we might think of Marx as a structuralist theorist, right? He says that capitalism and labor and production explain how human relations operate in a world of capitalism, right? And he's just like, that's it. That's my explanation. That's how things work, right? Or Ferdinand de Saussure, Saussure, is widely understood as the first structuralist. For him, that is language, right? The way that language operates is kind of a closed circle where, you know, words only refer to other words. They don't really refer to things outside of those words. And as a result, that is the structure that kind of explains how human communication operates. Saussure, Saussure. So, right, structuralism is like, we've got a closed system. It explains how things work, right? Wilderson is almost certainly a structuralist. He says that anti-Blackness explains how human relations and being work. Post-structuralism says that while those structures exist, they are not immutable. They can change. We kind of alter them in different ways. Yeah. So if you want to go to the third slide on the PowerPoint here, I'll talk a little bit about the etymology of the word queer and why I think it's really important to think of queer as a post-structuralist theory rather than just a structuralist theory. So queer etymologically comes from the Indo-European root word twerkwa. Okay, that Twerkw. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that word correctly because I obviously don't speak Indo-European. But from that root word, we then get the German word quer, which means to traverse. Okay, we also get the Latin word torquere, which means to twist. And then we also get the English word athwart. Okay, so if we think about the etymology of queer, right, it comes from twerkwa to quer and torque and athwart. Okay, what queer points toward then is a sense of traversal, or across or movement. Okay, so queer, it shifts, it turns, right? It's distinct then and means different things in different contexts and situations. Right, in Anna Marie Jagoza's words, this is the next slide on here. She says that queer, quote, is very much a category in the process of formation. Its definitional indeterminacy, its elasticity is one of its constituent characteristics, right? So this book, her book, this is amazing, by the way, if you're interested in this, Queer Theory and Introduction, really, really easy to read, really great description of kind of the history of what queer looked like in 1996 is when this was written, so it is a little old at this point, but still really useful. But so for her, then, at its core, queer is about movement, traversal, and difference. Okay, this, by the way, is important. This idea of movement, traversal, and difference is important both for thinking about queer as post-structuralism, right? It traverses these kind of social structures that other theorists think are, definitive and set in stone. And it's also important for thinking about queer as kind of oppositional or non-normativity, right? So jumping ahead a moment, we'll get back to this, but Edelman, and then eventually Stanley, who kind of position themselves as more anti-normativity, kind of end up drawing a lot from this queer as difference kind of thing. We'll come back to that, I promise. Right, but what I want you to get from that whole big rant right there is that at its core, queer is really about movement, it is about traversal, and it is about difference. Are you all with me so far? Great. So then, what becomes important is if we think about queer as this traversal, this movement, then this difference is that initially when queer is reclaimed, right? So we've got queer as kind of this derogatory term, mostly throughout the 1900s, and then circa 1990 at New York City Pride is kind of the moment, if we can isolate a moment, when queer starts being reclaimed. And if you jump ahead to the next slide, I've got a quote from Queer Nation was an activist group who released this pamphlet called Queers Read This at New York City Pride in 1990, which is probably the first time that queers really used in this kind of reclaimed oppositional way. And they say, well, yes, gay is great. It has its place, but when a lot of lesbians and gay men wake up in the morning, we feel angry and disgusted, not gay. So we've chosen to call ourselves queer, using queer as a way of reminding us how we are perceived by the rest of the world. It's a way of telling ourselves we don't have to be witty and charming people who keep our lives discreet and marginalized in the straight world. We use queer as gay men loving lesbians and lesbians loving being queer. Queer, unlike gay, doesn't mean male. And when spoken to other gays and lesbians, it's a way of suggesting we close ranks and forget temporarily our individual differences because we face a more insidious common enemy. Yeah, queer can be a rough word, but it is also a sly and ironic weapon we can steal from the homophobe's hands and use against him. Okay, so very explicitly here, queer is not gay, right? Queer is not gay, it is not lesbian, it is not an identity category, right? It is oppositional to identity, it is oppositional to normativity, right? And but it at once also kind of recognizes that the word queer has been used to signify violence, right? It's to say, let's take that violence, that violent position, and reclaim it, right? That's why the word reclaim is really important. And when you think about reclaiming different words in different contexts, it's that notice how it always takes a word that initially or before was violent, right? If we were having this conversation in like the 50s or the 60s, I would get fired for saying the word queer to you all, right? because, well, I guess, I don't know. In the 50s or 60s, people probably wouldn't have cared very much. But assuming that people cared, I would have gotten fired for saying that word, right? Because that would have been like pretty offensive, right? But we now live in 2024 where this word is pretty widely used in a lot of ways because the process of reclamation has allowed it to mean something different than what it used to mean. Right. So the history of that, queers read this, New York City Pride, 1990, releasing this pamphlet where it is kind of oppositional to the identity gay or lesbian. What's important then to take away from that, and kind of another point that's maybe a little bit broader and thinking about queer and what queer theory oftentimes does now, is that queer theory is very frequently a criticism of identity politics. Queer theory is very frequently a criticism of identity politics. Do you all know what the word identity politics means? Kind of, sort of. Tara, right? What's identity politics?
I guess
Kind of. Charlotte, you want to add to that?
It's just like arguing about identity and using it in how we like construct policies.
Yeah, I like that last part of using identity as a way to construct policies, right? So identity politics suggests that the primary focus by which politics ought to be conducted is along lines of identity and along lines of difference. And I mean, identity politics has certainly done a whole lot of really great things, right? It's why we have like diversity, equity, and inclusion boards. It's why we have, why am I just blanking on the words? Affirmative action in college, right? It does some pretty cool stuff, right? But at the same time, what queer criticizes about identity politics is that it staticizes what that difference is. Okay, it staticizes what that difference is. It suggests that because you reflect a certain difference about you in your identity, we can then characterize you as a kind of person who does or needs or believes X thing. And in doing so, a lot of queer theorists argue, identity politics buys into the very system that it is attempting to criticize. Okay, so, when we say things like, we always need to listen to X people in all instances, right? That becomes a staticized understanding of what that group of people believes and says, right? Part of the problem is that it then boxes those people into certain categories, right? If you do not believe that thing that you as that person are supposed to believe, then you are not good enough as that person. Right? It's static. It's stuck. And queer as movement, as traversal, wants to question that stuckness or that staticness. Right? Now, seriously, please don't get me wrong. Identity politics, in a lot of ways, is great. It really does some really important stuff. Right? But what queer theory invites us to consider is that there are some also pretty important limits to identity politics that we maybe need to rethink and then figure out how can we move past, but also consider identity within our politics. Does that make sense to everybody? Are you all with me? Okay. So we see in this quote here from Queer Nation, very much the opposite of identity politics, right? So gay men sleeping with lesbian women, right? A gay man, to be gay, is to be someone who is uninterested in sleeping with a woman. Lesbian, to have that sexual orientation, is to be defined as someone who is uninterested in sleeping with a man, right? That's weird. That's weird. It's odd that these gay men and these lesbian women are sleeping together, right? Because as gay, as lesbian, that's not a thing that they want to do, according to a statusized understanding of what that identity means, right? That's queer. Queer says that identity category is exploded. It doesn't mean the things you think it is. Right? Other examples, especially in the 90s and the early 2000s of kinds of queer versus identity politics is affirming gay shame instead of gay pride. Right? So I assume you all are familiar with what a gay pride festival is at this point. Right? So at a gay pride festival, we're supposed to celebrate being gay. Right? I just went to Nashville's Gay Pride Festival. It was insane. It was huge. The parade was like 5 hours long. I was super hot and dehydrated by the end of it. But the one common piece of every single person there and every single person in the parade, especially, was, yeah, let's celebrate you. Let's celebrate the fact that you're gay. Right? It's pride. It's happiness. Okay. In 2003, at the University of Michigan, a bunch of academics put on a conference about gay shame instead. And they said, what if instead of celebrating the pride of gayness, we instead affirmed gay as a way to shame normativity? Right? They were like, this pride thing has a bunch of limitations. It's corporatized, right? It's neoliberal. Every other float I saw at the Nashville Pride Parade was like Boeing. Or like I swear to you, there was shoot, I don't remember the company right now, but there was a drone company who had a float at the National Pride. It's like, oh my God, that is terrifying. Right? That is terrifying. We are like, let's celebrate being gay through drones and bombs. Right? That is normative now in a lot of ways. Because gay as an identity politics has been accepted as a thing that you are allowed to be. And as a result, in a lot of ways, it is co-opted by neoliberalism and capitalism and the military industrial complex as a justification for, I don't know, supporting Raytheon. Gay shame instead said, no, screw that. Right? A whole part of what this conference was about was, we think that the corporatization of gayness, or the idea of affirming pride within the public sphere, is bad. Right? Another example. So the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s, okay, killed a whole lot of people. AIDS, by the way, is still killing a whole lot of people across the world. But there was this group called the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, or ACT UP. The most famous AIDS activist group in the world. They've done a lot of cool stuff. Would recommend reading about them. It's like really interesting. A whole lot of their demonstrations were really happy and really campy. Do you all know what the word camp means? Yeah? Okay. Do you want to explain camp real quick? Oh, I thought you shook your head. Yes, maybe not. You just told me your name. I'm sorry. It's Eve. I knew it started with an E. Okay, Eve.
It's just like, I guess one way of explaining it is like so ironic that people like love it again.
Yeah, that's one way of thinking about it, right? It's so over the top. It's so ironic. It's just so insane and absurd that you can't help but love it.
After those like die-ins.
Oh, they did also do die-ins. You're right. But they did all those things at the same time. We'll get to that in 1 second. Like, there were demonstrations in 1990. ACT UP demonstrated on Wall Street, right? They were like, so in 1990, there's this drug called AZT, which was the first AIDS drug that was released. Burroughs Wellcome was the name of the pharmaceutical company that developed it. You will almost certainly read about Burroughs Wellcome on this topic. They have a lot of stuff in pharma. But AZT was super expensive, unaffordable, right? And so a whole part of this demonstration was ACT UP. They held signs that were like, sell Burroughs, or sell Wellcome, drop Wellcome, right? They were like, destroy their stock value because these assholes are why people can't access this medicine. But what's really interesting about this demonstration is not just that they were serious, because obviously they were, right? This is a pretty serious thing, right? But they also would like dress up in nun costumes, right? People would dress up as Jesus, right? They were campy. They were over the top. And a lot of, if you read the any memoirs from activists in ACT UP, a lot of what they say is that the reason why they loved being a part of this group is because they felt like it was a sense of community. They felt like they were home. They felt happy and enjoyed being around these other people, right? So while ACT UP also was known for the die-in, right, where they would literally pretend to be dead bodies in front of like the Federal Drug Administration, right? Really serious kinds of things. They also had these like weird, happy, campy moments. Right? That's clear. So if you want to go to the next slide, I have another quote that helps, I think, explain this a little bit. Also from Anna Marie Jagoza. Again, read this book. It's great. Both the lesbian and gay movements were committed fundamentally to the notion of identity politics and assuming identity as the necessary prerequisite for effective political intervention, right? So identity politics, to have effective political intervention, a staticized notion of identity is a prerequisite, okay? Queer, on the other hand, exemplifies a more mediated relation to categories of identification. Access to the post-structuralist theorization of identity as provisional and contingent, right? So if the structuralist understanding of identity is that identity is static, here's how it is, it explains how the world works. Post-structuralism, you know, it's provisional, it's contingent, it's different in different situations. We act it out differently. Access to the post-structuralist theorization of identity as provisional and contingent, coupled with a growing awareness of the limitations of identity categories in terms of political representation, enabled queer to emerge as a new form of personal identification and political organization. Okay, so if identity politics is this kind of static thing, queer emerges in the 90s as a different way to relate to identity and politics. Okay, is everyone with me so far? Cool. So if what we talked about so far is queers, etymology means kind of traversal, this across kind of thing. It's developed, reclaimed in the 1990s as kind of anti-identity politics. It's still important to recognize and kind of remember that as a word gets reclaimed, it is not detached from its previous meanings. Okay, as a word gets reclaimed, it is not detached from its previous meanings, right? So words have histories. So in other words, then, queer cannot be forgotten as an insult. Queer cannot be forgotten as an insult. And yet, that is part of what gives it its force and why it is so interesting and meaningful. So if you want to go to the next slide, I've got a quote from Judith Butler. Butler's my favorite queer theorist. She's probably my favorite theorist, period. Wonderful. I'm sorry, they, not she. That just changed recently. But wonderful, has some really, really smart stuff to say. They have a book in 2004 called Undoing Gender, which I think is a very easy book to read and to kind of understand their theories, right? So their best book, on my view, is Gender Trouble. That's released in, it's either 89 or 90. I don't remember right now. But that like shook the world. That's where they really developed the stuff that I'm about to talk about. But it's very complicated and very difficult to read. About the year 2000 or so, they got a lot of backlash from activists who were like, hey, we know that the stuff you're saying is really important, but we don't understand it because we don't have PhDs. Can you please make this simpler, please? And Butler was like, yeah, okay, why not? and then released this book in 2004 called Undoing Gender, which is way easier to read. Also just released a book in 2024 called it's either like Who's Afraid of Gender or something like that. Just if you look up Butler 2024, you'll find it. That book's also awesome, super easy to read. Anyways, I have a quote here from their book, Bodies That Matter, that talks a lot about how we have to still understand the insulting or insultive nature of queer when we are using it. Because again, words have histories, they're not really divorced from those things. So they say that queer derives its force precisely through the repeated invocation by which it has become linked to accusation, pathologization, insult. Okay, so the way that queer has force or power or authority is because it is linked to insult. Okay, the interpolation echoes past interpolations and binds the speakers as if they spoke in unison across time. So to simplify this then, the reason that queer can be reclaimed, the reason that people look at queer, so like in 1990, when Queers Read This was released, right, the reason that was even picked up in the first place is because queer was an insult, right? You can't just like make up a word and be like, yeah, this word is gonna, it now means traversal and weird and across and stuff, right? Because people will be like, what are you talking about? Right? It doesn't get picked up. It doesn't have force in the same way that a word like queer does, because of its connection to insult throughout history, right? But for Butler and for a lot of queer theorists, that's kind of the point. Okay, so Butler 101, just really quickly, this is kind of what they say, right? There is a structural force that we oftentimes will call heteronormativity that kind of weighs down on us, it shapes us, it influences what words can mean. But, right, so that's the structural piece of this, right? Heteronormativity, it's a thing, it's a structure, it helps explain how the world works. But, Butler says, in the repetition of certain words, like queer, slight changes happen. Okay, when we use words, they are never exactly the same as their previous uses. There is always something that is a little bit different about it. And that comes from the context, it comes from who we're talking to, it comes from the time, etc. Right? So there is room for things to change. But that change is slow, it is difficult, and it is certainly not like a big revolution against heteronormativity or anything like that. Right? So to give an example, and this example's maybe going to be a little weird, but it's the one that's always stuck with me when I was talking to my advisor about this. Deodorant. You all should wear it. If you're not wearing deodorant, please wear deodorant. It's great. What do non-binary people do? You go to Target, there is deodorant for men, there's deodorant for women. There is not a deodorant for non-binary people aisle at Target. There is a deodorant for men aisle, there is a deodorant for women aisle. Okay? When that person who identifies as neither male nor female, or neither man nor woman, goes down and picks out a deodorant that is designed for men, there is a structural force of heteronormativity that has interpolated that person as man. Okay? It is not a particular person that did that, right? It's not like someone's standing next to you at Target and is like, tell us now, are you a man or a woman? Decide what aisle you're in for your deodorant. Like, obviously, that's insane. That's not how things work. But the force of heteronormativity is shown through the fact that a non-binary person is forced to make that choice. They are forced to either decide, am I more man or am I more woman? Which deodorant do I buy? But at the same time, that person still has the agency to present themselves in certain ways, identify in certain ways, call themselves certain things in ways that are never exactly quite the same. Okay, so maybe that person buys a man's deodorant today, and then when that runs out in 2 months, they buy a woman's deodorant. Right? And also, obviously, the deodorant you buy does not define your gender. Right? That's insane. Right? Like, I wear women's deodorant. Like, I know it's more expensive, but I don't know why. Men's deodorant just doesn't really work for me. I get terrible pit stains, but women's deodorant is great. I really like, is it Glade, whatever that one is. Like, really works well for me. Am I a woman because I buy women's deodorant? No. Right? But in that moment, when I am buying that for myself, I am being interpolated as woman. But I still have the agency to say, to dress a certain way, to present myself a certain way, to cut my hair a certain way, to define myself in a certain way that is not that. Okay, so that's Butler 101, by the way. It's like structural force of heteronormativity, but post-structural because we kind of can have the agency to challenge that in some ways, even insofar as our agency is still constrained by that thing. Okay, but what's important is like, all of those things are contextual, all of those things are contingent, right? So what we would understand as queer now is very different than what queer was in 1990. Right? Men paint their nails all the time now. Is that queer? I don't know. Right? Hairstyles, ways of dress. These things change. Right? So what was queer at the time of New York City Pride 1990 may or may not be queer now, right? Like New York City Pride in 1990 probably was queer because New York City, I don't remember what year Pride starts, but 1990, it's like not really a widespread thing. Right? But now everyone and their mother has a Pride parade everywhere. Right? Pride parade's probably not queer anymore. Right? Is being gay queer? I don't know. In some ways, yes. And in some ways, no. Right? When I lived in Harrisonburg, I went to James Madison University for undergrad, right? Pretty small town in Virginia. I swear to you, there were 30 gay people in that town, the entire town, including myself. Right? Was being gay queer? Maybe. I now live in Nashville. And on the one hand, I walk down the street and literally everyone I see is gay. Right? Is being gay queer then? Maybe not. But at the same time, Tennessee, pretty conservative state. We got a lot of politicians who are not really up for gay people, kind of want to take away our rights there. So maybe being gay is queer. I don't know. Right? It's contingent. It's contextual. It's different in different times and spaces. So then, I want you all to think of queer as sometimes it's a noun, right? Sometimes we use it as an identity category. Sometimes we use it as oppositional to an identity category. And sometimes it's a verb. Right? So we've talked noun so far, you know, who is queer? What is queer? What might it mean to queer something as an action? Maybe it is making it weird or strange or uncomfortable. Right? So the example from that queers read this quote before of like gays sleeping with lesbians, lesbians sleeping with gays, that maybe is a queering. It is to make it weird. It is to make it strange. You are supposed to react to that by being like, that doesn't make any sense. This is weird. Right? It makes it kind of uncomfortable. Maybe it means to make it not straight though. Maybe it means to make it not heterosexual. Right? So the Human Rights Campaign, HRC, is the largest, I guess, gay organization in the country that kind of focuses on politics. Like they they do a lot of stuff in politics, but they have a campaign that they call Queering the Vote. Right? They call it Queering the Vote, which for them means getting more LGBTQIA plus people to vote. Right? So maybe making something queer, to queer something as a verb, is to make it not straight or not heterosexual. Part of what I want you to get from this, and why I'm saying maybe, maybe not, is that, you know, if queer is traversal, if queer is across, then queer also kind of has to be radically open. It is very difficult, I think, to look at someone using the word queer and say, no, that's not what queer means. Because I think that action of saying that's not what queer means is antithetical to what queer does and what queer means throughout its history. You look really stumped.
If queer is oppositional to like I guess like the corporatization of gayness and like pride and stuff, how can that usage of the word queer be not I don't know how to say this, but it feels like companies using the word queer like in pride parades like gets rid of the meaning and makes it's like a less queer.
Maybe. And there are a whole lot of people who make that argument, and I think make it really smart. Jasvier Poires is a really, really, really good author for this. But at the same time, if queer is traversal or across, then we therefore have to think about queer through context. And the context of the United States of America is that for a company to be able to call themselves queer and affirm LGBTQ plus people is really different.
Okay.
It is really anti-heteronormative. So yes and no is the answer to that question, I think. Yeah. And people debate about this all the time. I think like by this point, most theorists are pretty like, yeah, we don't really like Raytheon very much. Like, I think we're all pretty on board with like, hey, let's not bomb people in the Middle East. Like, but my point is just there is an argument to be had or an argument to be made that I think is worth engaging with and thinking about instead of just like trying to shut down that conversation. Okay, so I want to continue with this, like everything is weird, oppositional stuff. This is where a lot of queer theory and debate ends up coming in. Because if queer is anti-normative, then maybe it should be understood as oppositional politics. Okay, so we've got Halberstam's 2011 Queer Art of Failure book, where they define queer as, you know, maybe it's opposite to the side of success, right? Queers, Halberstam say, fail spectacularly, and that is what is really queer about us, is that the how normative society has defined success, we queer people can't ever possibly meet that, and therefore we have failed and we should be on the side of failure, right? There was a pretty successful team from Michigan who read this book as part of their argument and beat people all the time on, well, if we've failed, that's why you should vote for us, because it means that we've been queer and you should affirm queerness. There's a whole lot of things wrong with that line of reasoning, but they won a lot of debates on this, right? Or maybe the way that Lee Edelman in his book No Future defines queer is important, right? Edelman says that queer is the opposite of the future, right? Queer is the opposite. Queer is Edelman's pretty decently structuralist in saying that queer is structurally antagonistic toward civil society, toward the future, toward what he calls the child with a capital C. Right? He has a paragraph that I can't repeat in front of children where he says the F word a lot. Is like F little Annie orphan, F the child, F the future. And he's just like, that's what queer means. Right? If we all agree that heteronormativity is bad and violent and mean and evil, then maybe we should think of queer as oppositional to that. But maybe we can think of oppositional in a more idealistic way, right? So if you go to the next slide, we've got a pretty long quote from Jose Esteban Munoz, who wrote this phenomenal book, Cruising Utopia. One of my favorite books of all time, strongly recommend. So the first paragraph of this book says, queerness is not yet here. Queerness is an ideality. Put another way, we are not yet queer. We may never touch queerness, but we can feel it as the warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. We have never been queer, yet queerness exists for us as an ideality that can be distilled from the past and used to imagine a future. The future is queerness's domain. Queerness is a structuring and educated mode of desiring that allows us to see and feel beyond the quagmire of the present. The here and now is a prison house. We must strive in the face of the here and now's totalizing rendering of reality to think and feel a then and there. Okay, so if for Edelman, queerness is the opposite of the future, Munoz then writes this book in direct response to Edelman and says, no, queerness is the future. Queerness is that dawning forward, that desire for something better and something more, and a world where, you know, not this, whatever that might mean. Right? I really like the phrase, it's the warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. Right? So a horizon is something you can never reach. Right? You look out, you can see the horizon and you can walk towards the horizon, but as you walk towards it, it gets farther, it's still farther away, right? But at the same time, you can see that horizon. Like if you watch a sunset, it's beautiful, right? You can never get to the horizon, but it's something we can try to feel for and see, right? So if Edelman takes a pretty pessimistic understanding of how queer operates, Munoz takes a pretty optimistic one. And I'm, obviously showing my hand here by having the Munoz quote and not the Edelman quote, but I definitively think Munoz is right. And we'll talk more about that towards the end here in a few minutes. Right, but so maybe queerness is radical negativity, maybe queerness is an embracement of failure, maybe it's an embracement of the future and radical possibility, maybe queerness is such a radically different or non-normative position that it has to be, as Stanley terms it, overkill. So you go to the next slide, got a pretty long quote from Stanley here as well. Overkill is a term used to indicate such excessive violence that it pushes the body beyond death. Overkill is often determined by the post-mortem removal of body parts, as was the case with both Lauren Page and Rashawn Brazel. The temporality of violence, the biological time when the heart stops pushing and pulling blood, yet the killing is not finished, suggests the aim is not simply the end of a specific person, but the ending of trans/queer life itself. This is the time of trans/queer death, when the utility of violence gives way to the pleasure in the other's immortality. If trans/queers, along with others, approximate nothing, then the task of ending, of killing that which is constituted as already dead, must go beyond normative times of life. In other words, if Lauren Page was dead after the first few stab wounds, then what do the remaining 50 wounds signify? So Stanley says that queer is that which must be eliminated by kind of broader heteronormative society, right? It is that which is not only oppositional to, but which by definition must be eliminated by heteronormativity. So the reason that I kind of just introduce all of these different understandings of queer, both as noun and as verb, is to suggest to you that it does a lot of different things in a lot of different ways for a lot of different people in a lot of different contexts. Right? It shifts, it moves. I don't think it's really possible to hold down queer itself. Right? Like when these people write these books, it's very rare that people will write and say, this other person who understands queer this way is wrong, and we should not think about it like this. It is very rare, almost basically never, that someone does that. Instead, the way that people write and think about queer is additive. Even as that additive nature is conflicting with what queer was doing before. Right? So there are a whole lot of people who read, for example, Edelman and Munoz together. And that's probably the most famous quote unquote fight within queer theory is Edelman writes this polemic of like queer radical negativity. Munoz is like, no, actually it's radical futurity. That's one of the maybe only times I can remember where people in queer theory are explicitly like, no, you're wrong. But even then, queer allows scholars to take those oppositional books and theories and put them together and try and think differently about what queer can do. Right? And so that's what's really cool and interesting about it and why I study it academically, but also what makes it so complicated and so messy and chaotic and unpredictable, but also really fun. And I think super interesting. Right? Because it is and is not identity. It is and is not a criticism of identity. Right? It is and is not something that we do and enact, etc. Right? So I will end with my very brief thoughts about how this kind of thread, all of this stuff kind of works together is that it's like I find myself to be pretty optimistic. I kind of can't imagine what living in the world would look like if I were to wholeheartedly embrace Edelman or Stanley and just be like, that's it, overkill. But the way that I think about those kinds of more pessimistic takes is that these polemics are necessary, but not sufficient. Right? We needed Edelman to write in 2004 that queer was radical negativity. We needed Stanley to write Atmospheres of Violence and remind us that queer and trans people are still being murdered constantly. Right? We need those reminders. But at the same time, we can't let that be it. Because then we've come to what is basically now what? I don't know. I will also say that it's hard for me to read someone like Eric Stanley as a queer theorist. I kind of think of him more as like, I mean, like he's writing about some really terrible things, but I think he's too structuralist, right? The thing that I myself find very important about queer theory is its post-structuralist takes, because that's what in its history separated it from gay and lesbian theory, feminist theory, and race theories of race in the like 1990s. Is people were like, hey, the problem with these things is that they're too staticized, they're too structuralist, the world is super closed. We need to think more about how we can push that. And so maybe then queer theory. Right. So while I think that Edelman and Stanley and to some extent Halberstam's a little bit more optimistic than either of those people, are important and meaningful, and we should read and engage with their work, I myself find them not anywhere near as persuasive as someone like Munoz or Butler, who wants to give us ways to figure out how to survive in a world, you know, that is oftentimes oppositional towards. But I don't know. Those are just my thoughts. There are very smart, educated people who disagree with me, and I think that's super legitimate. And again, part of what's cool about queer is that like we can have these debates all the time. What all of this should also tell you is that to read queer theory in debate is difficult. And to answer queer theory in debate is very possible. And I think it is very legitimate to read the scholars who say, no, we need to take more optimistic stances against the more pessimistic stances that people oftentimes read. Right? So like last year, my team from MBA read Stanley in a couple of debates, and a whole bunch of what we talked about before those debates started were both me being like, oh my God, this is so simple and wrong and missing so many things. Oh my God, we should think more complicatedly about this stuff. But more importantly, how do we answer the other teams who's going to say, like, no, you're thinking about this wrong. We need to think more optimistically and more open about this stuff because that scholarship's really good. Those cards are very good in response to this kind of pessimistic take. So if you're someone who wants to read the more pessimistic arguments, you really got to think that through and how you want to put those pieces together. Because, and last little ranting thought is another thing that I really like about queer theory is that it forces us to think in ways that are a lot more complicated than most other theories, at least as they're deployed in debates, invite us to think, right? So, 90% of K debates in high school, at least, end with, you said the state is bad, right? Which, like, yeah, obviously the state does a bunch of really bad stuff, but queer theory invites us to think of the state as both bad and good, right? The answer is never yes, no, good, bad, right? A debate tells us to think like that because we're forced to negate each other, right? We're forced to say the other team is wrong. But there are so few scholars who actually write like that because the world is such a complicated place, right? And context is so key for how we think about, I don't know, violences against certain people based on race, gender, nationality, sexuality, etc., such that we need to try and push ourselves to consider that, I don't know, maybe the state isn't always bad, right? Like, yeah, the state sucks, but like, I love having healthcare. Healthcare is great, right? I've had this conversation with a couple different students of like if you want to transition, how are you going to afford HRT? You need healthcare, right? And like, healthcare sucks in this country in a million different ways, but like, God, it's better than nothing, right? So I don't know. That is definitely me getting on a soapbox, and I can step off that. I am over time now, but I'm happy to stick around if y'all have questions. Otherwise, you're free to go.